Han Solo is a lovable and slightly overgrown street urchin on the mean streets of Corellia, but soon enough he finds himself on an adventure involving a failed heist, a team of criminal misfits like himself, and more than a few twists and turns on the way to becoming the lovable rogue we know so well. As we saw last week with Deadpool 2, sequels can be difficult, but arguably the spin-off is even harder. You don't have the familiar crutches of the main plot and all of its elements to lean on, and yet you still have to have the same tone as the main franchise. And in this case it's even more difficult, because you're not just dealing with any franchise. When you deal with Star Wars, you're really dealing with the collective shared childhood of a certain generation of men who happen to be very vocal on the internet and have a lot of disposable income that they can spend on things like merchandise and Funko Pops and stuff like that. Now the team dealing with the main storyline of Star Wars have actually done quite a good job of this. I mean, J.J. Abrams really lent on the plot of the originals when he did The Force Awakens, and Rian Johnson, who has been really brave with how he deals with Star Wars Legacy, hasn't exactly had like a unanimous approval for what he's done with that. So I can imagine the pressures behind the scenes that might lead to firing two perfectly capable writers and directors, Phil Lord and Christopher Miller. They were kicked off this movie like 5 months into production, at which point Ron Howard took over and reshot about 70% of the film apparently. When I heard Ron Howard had been hired, that's a bit of a tongue twister, I was a little bit worried about it because he is basically a safe pair of hands. When I think about Ron Howard, I think about boring films by and large. Things like The Da Vinci Code and Inferno, or whatever the other Dan Brown stuff is called. You know, they're competently made, but they were really, really dull. With all that said, actually the film itself was a real surprise. I had a lot of fun watching it. It definitely gets the main thing right about blockbusters, which is like watchability, I think. This weird balance between comedy and high stakes action that somehow gels and doesn't make the characters seem like complete sociopaths, makes you actually feel like you're having fun while you're watching it. How they manage that, I have no idea, and probably says more about our culture than anything else. I mean, the plot's nothing new and it's mostly communicated through overblown exposition speak through the lead characters, but then it's a Star Wars film. That's kind of the idea. But the soundtrack of the movie is really good, and that's where the emotion and the beat of the film sits. The cinematography is really good. It's by Bradford Young, who shot Arrival for Denis Villeneuve as well. It's often quite high contrast and desaturated. You often see people almost in silhouette against a blown out background. There's a lot of fog and overcast skies, not things that you see normally in blockbusters, so that's really nice to see. It's not just good cinematography for a blockbuster, it's good cinematography in and of itself. And they have that fun kind of world-building set design that I think really makes the Star Wars movies stand out a bit more and definitely distinguishes them from like those terrible prequels that are all shot on green screen. You have like a luxury yacht where there's a face in a jar that floats around and sings, and that's sort of like that weird rat creature that Jabba the Hutt had. It's just weird stuff that's in the Star Wars world. Okay, that makes sense, I guess. And so because of all this stuff hanging together, you know, the film is technically competent, but also it's a lot of fun. It just feels watchable. And it also has that important quality of keeping the same tone as its original franchise. It feels Star Wars-y, and in a way that Rogue One, for instance, doesn't, I think. Rogue One always felt kind of mean-spirited and sad and fatalistic, and I think that's something that you couldn't say about Solo. In the end, it zips along, it's light, it's fun, it's funny, and it has this visual inventiveness to it and a sort of playfulness in the way that it approaches itself. Whether that's Lord and Miller or Howard, I don't really think you can disentangle, but either way, I think the film is a success overall. Which is good, because the one thing this did worse than Rogue One, and even The Last Jedi or The Force Awakens, is distinguishing itself from the films that preceded it. When they first announced these anthology films that were going to come basically on alternate years with the main franchise, apart from thinking, oh god, more blockbusters for me to watch from Disney, fantastic, I was also thinking, do we really need to have all of that backstory explained? Do I need to know where Han Solo grew up? Do I need to know how Boba Fett trained? Do I need to know how the plans were got to the rebels at the start of A New Hope? And so what happens is you end up with a lot of callbacks, or call forwards, I suppose, to the original trilogy, which just doesn't work. It does nothing other than bring you out of the film after a while. You know, I'm going into a Han Solo film expecting to find out how Chewie and Han meet up. I think that makes sense for that story to contain that. But I don't need to know how the Kessel Run line, the single line about that in A New Hope, came to be, you know, what the Kessel Run is or whatever. I don't need to know how Han got his blaster specifically. I don't need to know what the significance of the dice that he carries around as a good luck charm is. I don't need a scene where someone says, what's your surname? And he says, I don't have one. I'm on my own. I don't have people. And then the guy goes, Han Solo. I don't need those kind of references in the film. With all these references, you end up with the feeling that they live in this universe of coincidences where absolutely everything is significant in some way to their long-running characters. If that sounds like the kind of thing you want, I highly suggest that you reconsider that, not least because that's the kind of thing that pulled down the prequels. You know, it wasn't enough for Anakin Skywalker to have built his own robot, but it had to be C-3PO. None of those things have to tie together, and yet in the end they do so, which does nothing but make the universe of the film feel smaller, which is not what you want a Star Wars film to feel. This becomes increasingly problematic when you layer it on top of the problems that a prequel already has to deal with, like when Han Solo's love interest, who I've never heard of despite having seen every other bit of media to do with Star Wars, shows up on screen in the first 5 minutes, and I go, well, you're not in the rest of the stuff, so I'm not holding great hopes for how this is going to turn out for you. One or two references like that are fine, and it can even make it feel tied into the wider universe that the story is part of, but too many of them and it feels almost ritualized, fetishistic. It constantly and unpleasantly reminds you that what you're watching isn't really a story told for its own worth, but really just a massive post-rationalization exercise for tiny bits of backstory in a set of films that are like 40 years old, and that the people that you're watching on screen now and the people making that film grew up on and are now making a sort of hagiography for. So if, you know, that's your bag, then okay, but I'd like to see the film just tell its own story. Maybe that's just me, but I'd like to find out from you in the comments down below if you have anything to say about it. You like how I snuck that in there? I really tied it into the debate, you know? Solo is a bit of a weird name for something that is so self-consciously part of a larger whole, and one that feels increasingly like it's just been designed in order to exploit audiences as much as possible. But to the film's credit, it does at least work on its own auspices, you know? It's its own movie and it functions properly in that sense. So fair play to Ron Howard or Christopher Lord, Philip Miller, whoever their names are, the people who made this film, whoever it was who has control over this. And in fact, the whole team, you know, congratulations, well done, you did a good one. Cheers.